If you're someone who wants to get into bossing in RuneScape 3 but isn't sure how to start, this is the video for you. In this video I will be going through 5 of the best bosses to help ease you into endgame PVM and improve your PVM skills. I recently made a video discussing 7 account goals before getting into bossing, and if you haven't checked that out, I recommend watching it and trying to complete those goals before really diving into endgame PVM and endgame bosses. But as long as you have fairly high combat stats and good gear, you should be able to work towards defeating these 5 bosses and hopefully learn some tips and tricks along the way. The first boss I recommend beginners get into is God Wars Dungeon 1, specifically Kree'arra and K'ril. They are the 2 best God Wars Dungeon 1 bosses because they do make you the best GP per hour. Both bosses can make you pretty good GP per hour. If you are a fairly high level, you can get around 5 or 6 mil per hour from each boss. But if you are a newer player, you probably would get less kills per hour. But still, you should get a few mil per hour in profit, which should help. All God Wars Dungeon 1 bosses have very few mechanics, and it's more so just a DPS test. So you're just trying to do as much damage per second as possible to kill the boss as fast as possible. So you are going to be able to practice your different ability rotations and improve your DPS. The main reason why I put God Wars Dungeon 1 in general as the first boss is that you need to do this to get the devotion ability. It is the easiest way to get it, so as long as you are spending a bit of time at God Wars Dungeon 1, you have a better chance at getting the devotion ability, which will help you for the next boss on the list. The next boss that I highly recommend beginners try is the Glacor. In my opinion, it is the best boss for beginners to learn. It has a normal mode where you can actually pick which mechanics you want active, and you can learn a lot of different things. You can deal with different minions that spawn. You can deal with prayer flicking. It has the Pillars of Ice mechanic where you have to move around and dodge a certain attack. It has the Frost Cannon, which you need to remember to have Devotion active for that, and Exposed Core, which is just a DPS test. So it really has all the different mechanics of boss fights. So that's why I find the Glacor is probably the best boss for newer players to learn, because if you do have all of those mechanics active, you will be seeing them in a lot of different other bosses. And if you can practice them and get good at them, then you are going to be set and you'll learn a ton from mastering the Glacor. The boss also has a hard mode where all of the mechanics are active, and it even has an enrage system. So the higher the enrage is, the stronger the Glacor is, the more health it has, the more damage it deals, and sometimes it does add an extra mechanic, like with the minions that spawn, it will summon a bolstered Glaciite, which is a lot stronger. The Glacor really is one of my favorite bosses. It can be done from a really low level account with no mechanics on normal mode, but you can also push this boss all the way up to 4,000% in rage. The GP per hour from Glacor is great. You get a lot of really good common loot, especially if you are streaking in hard mode. But even if you are just wanting to learn the boss in normal mode, focusing on certain mechanics, you will be making a few million coins per hour, which is great. You'll get some good combat XP. So it really is a great boss to try and learn and master. If you are looking to get into PVM, it gives you all of the mechanics that you need to know for future bosses. The next boss that I recommend you learn is Vindicta, or some of the God Wars Dungeon 2 bosses. Vindicta is the most popular God Wars Dungeon 2 boss, and I do recommend doing Vindicta rather than the others. It is my favorite. I have almost 800 kills. And so Vindicta does have a few mechanics. It actually has 2 different phases. One where you're actually fighting Vindicta. He will have a few mechanics that will deal quite a bit, but nothing to really watch out for. Probably the most famous mechanic of Vindicta is the purple flames that will spawn. All you need to do is walk out of them to avoid taking damage. Once you get Vindicta down to 100,000 life points, you will be fighting Vindicta and Gorvek, which will be a bit different. This is actually the harder part of the boss fight. Gorvek will use a melee attack, then a range attack, which will hit quite hard, and then another melee attack. This is where you can start to learn defensive abilities. If you aren't killing the boss very fast, then I highly recommend you would bring a shield and then equip this shield and use resonance on that ranged hit for Vindicta. So you can see I use resonance right here on that hit, and you'll get a nice heal of I think 1,000 to 3,000 health. So that is really helpful. You can also use things like Reflect or Devotion on the ranged hit, and that way you will just take less damage. Vindicta was one of the first bosses that I learned probably 7 years ago or so, and I do remember it being a bit difficult, and that is really where I learned the concept of using the defensive abilities and just how powerful they are. So learning things like Resonance, like Reflect and Devotion, that could be really helpful to learn with Vindicta. And I do recommend that you go through the mechanics and actually try to avoid them. Once you do have good enough gear, you will be able to just kill Vindicta pretty fast without even having to worry about those things. But if you are just getting into bossing, it'll probably take a minute or 2 minutes to kill the boss, which is fine, and that is just a good time to actually go through and learn the different mechanics, because you will be seeing similar things from other bosses in the future. Next on my list is Kerapac, specifically in normal mode because hard mode is really difficult, but beginners should be able to start to learn Kerapac, especially once they have mastered the Glacor or at least learned the mechanics. The nice thing about Kerapac is it introduces a special action button, which is available for certain bosses. And so you will be able to get some familiarity for that special action button and when to use it. It is different for every boss if they do have a special action button, but it does give you another thing to sort of watch out for in the boss fight. Kerapac also has quite a few mechanics which will be good to learn. One is the time threads mechanic, which is its first actual mechanic of the boss fight. Kerapac will say, "I will tear right through you," and then spawn a time warp, which you can just stand under the boss to avoid. Kerapac also has the jumping slam mechanic, where he will fly into the air, and you need to time the surge properly so you don't get hit from a pretty big melee hit. So really, it is a good boss to learn all of these things. I do remember my first time learning even normal mode Kerapac, and it was quite difficult, just learning all of these mechanics and being able to avoid them. So it will probably take you a little while to learn Kerapac. It is a pretty strong boss and will deal a fair amount of damage. That being said, if you did train up your necromancy and get tier 90 necromancy gear, which isn't too difficult to obtain, this boss shouldn't be that difficult for you. You will just need to learn the mechanics, and it should be just fine. Another really big positive about Kerapac is that you do make a lot of money from fighting this boss, especially since the manuscripts of Jazz went up to about 500k each. You are going to be making a ton of money if you just learn normal mode Kerapac. It is a bit harder than the previous mentioned bosses, but it will be worth it, and you will also learn some pretty good mechanics that will help you with future bosses. The fifth boss that I recommend beginners start to learn is Araxxor. Now, Araxxor, it is probably the hardest boss on this list. Back in the day, I remember this boss was one of the more difficult bosses in the game, and it has become a bit easier just with power creep. And even if you are using tier 90 or even tier 70 or 80 necromancy, you should have no problem at Araxxor. But there are quite a few mechanics and complexities to this boss that you will need to learn. First off, there's 3 different paths. You have path 1, which is the minion path. That's what I'm taking right now. Path 2, which is the acid path. And path 3, which is the darkness path. So there are 3 different paths to learn. It probably would take more of an Araxxor guide to learn all the mechanics around the boss, but there are a few things that you will need to watch out for. One is that web mechanic. If you do hit Araxxor when the web is down, you will get 100% of the damage reflected back at you, and so there are countless times where you would be using a big powerful ability right before that goes down, and it insta-kills you. It's happened to me many times, but it is something to just learn from this boss. Araxxor also has a cleave mechanic where it will bring you in and swipe using a sort of a cleave attack. And if that hits you, it will hit for a few thousand damage. You just need to watch out for it. You can either use Anticipate so it doesn't bring you in, or you just back up or use Escape or something like that. There are many other mechanics like the egg drop. If you are on the minion path, he will spawn minions, and you need to watch out for the mirrorback spiders and also the pulsing spiders, which will heal Araxxor. But overall, this boss fight does have a lot to it, a lot of different mechanics, and you probably will find it difficult at the start. My one recommendation for players that are learning Araxxor is just to keep your health high. You are going to make mistakes, and Araxxor does punish you for that, but it's not like he will insta-kill you. He'll hit you for a few thousand damage. So as long as you always have fairly high life points, those mechanics, when you do mess them up, it won't insta-kill you. So again, Araxxor, a really great boss to learn for beginner players. You can make pretty good GP per hour from Araxxor. However, completing the leg requires you to get the 3 different pieces, and that might take quite a bit of time. So you can make a lot of money from Araxxor in the long run, but it is also a really good boss to learn just for the mechanics and learning all of the different paths. And so those are the 5 bosses that I would recommend beginners try to learn. I do think that each of the bosses have their own mechanics that once you do learn them, it will be really helpful for the future, especially when you are learning some harder bosses. Now, that being said, there are 2 bosses I did want to mention. They are definitely not beginner bosses, but I do highly recommend you strive to learn them, at least in the long run. One being Raziel, the first Necromancer, if you are using Necromancy. For me, I found this boss extremely difficult when I first tried it, especially that last phase of 200,000 life points, where you have to move around and basically use full manual abilities. That is one of the hardest things to do with bossing, is get away from using Revolution and actually manually using each of your individual abilities. And so for me, by mastering Raziel, the first Necromancer, I am now able to use basically full manual with Necromancy. I don't need to rely on Revolution. In fact, I only use Revolution on my 3 basic abilities, and in the last phase, I just throw it all out the window and manually click them all. So I do find that Raziel is one of the best bosses to learn full manual. It sort of forces you to do that, and so I highly recommend striving to defeat Raziel with Necromancy if that is the route you are going to take. Another boss that I found extremely difficult when learning, and I still find quite difficult, is Raksha, especially dealing with the anima pools. It, again, is not a beginner boss, but it is one that I would strive to learn eventually, especially once you are comfortable with those 5 beginner bosses. Raksha really makes you focus on prayer flicking. It is extremely important with the boss fight. And then dealing with the anima pools, where you need to basically destroy them all within 5 seconds or so, or else Raksha will start powering up. You know, it is a pretty high pressure boss fight, but one that is really rewarding. And once you do learn it, you know, it is really satisfying, and you will know a lot more about PVM. You'll be a lot more comfortable with prayer flicking and dealing with other mechanics and fighting other minions, since you are going to have to be comfortable with the anima pools. So anyway, I did want to include those 2 final bosses, not really for beginners, but for players that are looking for something to strive for when mastering PVM. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found the video helpful, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace.